All right, everyone, let's get started. My name is Roland Vogel. I'm Executive Director of CodeX, the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. CodeX is a joint center between the law school and the computer science department. Our mission is to use information technology and make the legal system more efficient for all stakeholders in the legal system, not just the legal profession. So welcome to our CodeX Speaker Series. Our speaker today is Professor Bart Verheij. Bart is a lecturer and researcher in the Institute for Artificial Intelligence and Cognitive Engineering of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Bart is also this year's residential CodeX fellow, and you know, it's been a real pleasure to have Bart here. He's brought a tremendous amount of intellectual energy to our center, so it's been really very valuable to have him here. He holds a PhD degree from Maastricht University. He's been through his dissertation already been focusing on the formal modeling of legal argumentation, and legal argumentation is really his primary focus. So he's coming to the legal system really from initially a math background. So he's also been the chair of last year's ICAL conference, the International Conference for Artificial Intelligence in Law, which is really the main conference in the AI and law field. He's authored several books on argumentation, on designing arguments, the design of argument assistance for lawyers and other arguers. And he's also focused on much on legal evidence and proof and statistics, stories, and logic in this context. So Bart's talk today is titled To Catch a Thief with and Without Numbers. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Roland. So also for me, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a real honor to have this audience. And also it's an honor to be here for the year. My family and I have moved over thanks to the opportunity that has been given to us by the CodeX group, led scientifically by Mike Genesareth and also by Roland Vogel, who just introduced me. And this year, I am going through a phase, as they say. So I also think that it may have to do with my age, but it also simply has to do with the content of my research. And in a sense, I'm going back. Yes? It's not loud enough. I hear it. Is this better? And the talk that I will give today is about my theoretical development, but I'm trying to tell it in such a way that it is accessible for a wider audience. And it is about the role of evidence to determine who committed the crime or not. And in the Netherlands, this is nowadays strongly associated with a famous case, an infamous case actually, the Lucia de Burgh case. Lucia de Burgh is a nurse, or she was a nurse. She went to jail for 6.5 years before she was again released. And why was she in jail? Because she was convicted of several murders. And the basis of this conviction was a statistical argument. Not just statistics, but the statistics played a huge role. And well, this led to an enormous amount of discussion. And if you see here the number of hits, 2 million, something like that, on Google, then there is something strange going on. Either you are very famous for a good reason or for not such a good reason. And well, for Lucia de Burgh, it was not so pleasant what she has been going through. And I'm now here in California, in the Netherlands now, a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, even a film was released about her story. And if you read the Dutch subtitle, schuldig tot je onschuld is bewezen, that means guilty until proven innocent. Well, that's the reversal of what we are typically thinking, right? So what happened? Well, there is a picture of Lucia. That's Lucia de Burgh, the nurse And she had been around too many strange situations. That's the basis of what happened. And then an expert came in and he said, well, I've looked at the data and I've seen how many deaths there were when Lucia was around. I've seen how many deaths there were when Lucia was not around. And he said, and he calculated that the probability is 1 in 342 million that the nurse's shifts coincide with so many unexplained deaths and resuscitations. And then he said something that you will now probably strongly regret. He said, dat kan geen toeval zijn. That cannot be by chance. And that was, let's say, the basis of the conviction of Lucia de Burgh, she was sentenced for life imprisonment, and then a long debate ensued, and now she has been released a couple of years ago. And now the strangest thing of it is that we now not even believe anymore that there were murders. We now think that all the deaths that she was involved in, or at least that she was around, were natural deaths. So this is a very bad situation. And of course, this is part of the explanation. Of course, it can be an accident. Accidents do happen. So if, for instance, someone in this audience wins the lottery, yeah, well, that's by accident. And it's not immediately then the case that you are a fraud winning the lottery. And that's what here has been assumed, basically. So there was indeed a strange coincidence. She had been around a lot of deaths and resuscitations. But well, that can be a coincidence. And what's more important, that was not really the question. The question was whether there were murders and whether Lucia de Burgh was a murderer. And then the question is, how much do these statistics tell you about that question? Well, not so much, I would say. And that's the topic of this talk. So the discussion about the role of mathematics and statistics in courts has been around forever, but recently it has again gained momentum, namely by what I like to call the DNA effect. So there has, of course, been a tremendous success in evidential thinking by the role of DNA. And now I've been told by a good friend in the Netherlands, Peter van Kappen, a legal psychologist that has influenced my thinking about evidence strongly. And he tells me that when he goes to courts as an expert witness, as a legal psychologist, he's often called to the courts to be an expert witness. He tells us that nowadays, with all kinds of evidence, judges and others ask about the numbers that go with the evidence. So for instance, can you give us the probability that a witness is telling the truth or something like that? Well, that's not so easy to estimate. So there is this DNA effect. It seems to some that evidence is only valuable when it comes with scientifically supported statistics. And for DNA, this is something that is really there. But for many other kinds, the situation is much less ideal. So, and there is a good side of this effect. So there is, of course, also the effect that by DNA we are now looking better, let's say, at the role of evidence and the statistical foundation of also fingerprints and scent tests and things like that. But let's start with the success of DNA. So why is it so successful? It has high information value. So it is indeed true that our DNA profiles are very informative to determine whether a sample that is taken from my tissue is actually mine. Because, well, we all have different DNA profiles, let's say. The differences between people are so strong that the chances of a match are quite limited. There is a strong scientific foundation, so also the reasons why these DNA profiles are so well distributed across people are quite well understood. They have to do, let's say, with the mutation rate of the DNA molecule and things like that. I don't know the details about it, but it's well understood. And you can report good, scientifically well-founded numbers that go with them. So if you have a sample that was found on the crime scene and you have a sample that was taken from a suspect, then you can find a match and determine the random match probability, as it is called, the number that tells you how likely it is, how probable it is that match was found just by coincidence. But of course, also DNA is limited. And sometimes it's forgotten, and not by the people that are professionals in this area, but it's good to mention them at least. Of course, also DNA profiling does not give the answer to all questions that you would like to see answered, because the world is quite complex. And here are a few of the limitations that are relevant to mention. So first, there is an issue for scientists that establish, let's say, the value of DNA profiles in general. There is the issue of dependencies between loci. And the loci are the spots on a DNA molecule that are measured, let's say, that determine whether or not there is a match between two profiles. And there are dependencies. So also it depends on the background. So for instance, in the Netherlands, probably the DNA distribution is a little bit different from the distribution in the United States. Of course, especially this is the case when also there are different ethnical variations. But perhaps more importantly, there is also the issue of twins. There are quite a lot of twins around, and we don't know about all the twins. So the number of twins, I've been told, is something like 1 in 1,000 or something like that. And if you then think of the numbers that are good that go with DNA profiles, 1 in 9 billion or something like that, there is at least the necessity to consider that difference. And perhaps more importantly for the story for today, there is also wrong DNA. And that's one of the examples of the context of evidence. That's the limitation at the bottom. So sometimes you do work with DNA, but it is unfortunately the wrong DNA. So there is this strange situation with Dr. John Schneeberger. He was a rapist from Canada. He was a doctor. And he had been tested several times for his DNA. So material was taken from him. It was tested. It was matched with the DNA material that was found on the crime scene. And there was never a match. And what did this doctor do? He had under his skin a different kind of material. He had a drain under his skin. So he just fooled, let's say, the investigators. And they took different DNA from someone else. And of course, then there was no match with his original DNA as found on the crime scenes. And another sad story is known as Das Heilbronner Phantom, and there it worked the other way around. So this has to do with the picture that you see here. There was a lady, a police officer, Michelle K. She was from Germany, and she was murdered. And well, because of when there is a police murder, there is of course a lot of attention and a lot of investigation going on. But there was also a DNA sample found. And what happened was, after that DNA sample, it turned out that all over Europe, there were also crimes that had the same DNA profile. But it was strange, because there was no match. There were very different crimes, not all police murders or that kind of severe situation, but also thefts and smaller robberies and things like all over Europe. They found things, and it seemed that there was no connection. It took a lot of efforts because, well, at first, of course, it was thought that this was some kind of criminal organization doing bad things, etc. Until finally they found out that the only thing that was in common between all those cases was the use of the sticks. They came from the same factory. They used sticks, and these were contaminated sticks. They were from an Austrian factory. They were, for some reason, contaminated with the DNA of one person, probably someone working in that factory, and that was why there was this match of all these profiles. Completely unrelated crimes. There's also, of course, the possibility of laboratory errors. There is the possibility of DNA mixtures, not one person, but several persons in one mixture. But more generally, it is the context of evidence. So even if you would have a perfect situation, you know that there is a match, the number is high, the quality of the sample is excellent, then you at best only have information about whether someone was at the crime scene. But you want to know more. Typically you want to know, for instance, whether someone is the murderer or the thief or the robber or whatever. And that's something that needs to be taken into account. It's a limited tool. So then, something happened because of this DNA effect. Namely, at least in my country, I have that feeling, lawyers feel kind of stupid, let's say. So the scientists now have this strong scientific tool set behind them, and they say, well, you judges, they are in the Netherlands, the judges are the ones who decide about the facts. You judges, well, you don't understand statistics, do you? And that they are backed also by long-standing history in cognitive science. We all know that we are bad at statistics, right? There have been Nobel Prizes awarded for that. And we are also bad at logic. So, well, and the people from the Forensic Science Institutes, they now tell the lawyers, you should learn about statistics. But my personal stance is a little bit different. I do agree that it is very helpful for lawyers and also lay people to know about statistics, but I also like to emphasize that typically what lawyers and lay people do works quite okay. So I'm actually defending what we do, let's say, how rational and how reasonable our behavior is, also when thinking about evidence. And in fact, also the forensic science experts, they have their limitations. They are not always aware of what is happening in court, let's say. For instance, one thing that forensic scientists forget about is that judges have to decide about the case. They really commit to a decision. And that's something that forensic scientists never do. They only report about probabilities and about likelihood ratios, about, let's say, the value of this piece of evidence in relation to the rest of the evidence that was already there, which is a very different situation. And that's good. But ideally, you would like to see a situation in which there is a sufficient understanding across the borders of, on the one hand, lay people and judges, and on the other hand, the scientists who are used to numbers. So let's work on that. So let's design a practical shared normative framework. And then there are 3 normative frameworks in the literature. If you look at the literature on evidential reasoning, you see 3: argumentation, scenarios, and probabilities. Argumentation, well, that's very recognizable for lawyers. That's about arguments pro and con. There's the evidence for the suspect having committed the crime, the arguments against a suspect having committed the crime. So there are also these normative maxims that go with argumentation, such as take all arguments into account. Don't forget some of the arguments. And look at both the pros and the cons. Don't look only on one side. Assess the strength and the relative strength of the different pieces of evidence, the arguments, and avoid fallacies. There's also scenario thinking, and this is especially popular also in my country, but it started actually in this thinking about scenarios in the United States, I would say. So one thing that normatively goes with scenario thinking is consider alternative scenarios. Not only the story that was told to you by the prosecution, but also listen well to what the defense is telling about what may have happened in a crime situation. Assess the plausibility of stories. Look at the gaps that are in the stories. Look at the strange aspects, the things that require special support. And consider also which evidence is explained or contradicted. And then there is, of course, probabilities. And basic thing there is use the calculus. There is good mathematics there, and follow that. Don't make mistakes there. Don't misinterpret the conditional probabilities. They have a conditional relation from one side to the other, from a condition to a conclusion. And what is typically going wrong is that you go from the conclusion to the condition or something like that. And don't forget the a priori probabilities. And maybe you've heard of some of those. This is not a lecture about the details of this, but understand that there are different kinds of normative maxims that go with these 3 styles of reasoning. And the first 2 argumentation scenarios, they don't use numbers. They are what typically feels good for lay people and lawyers. And probabilities, well, that's where the numbers are, and that's where also the scientists and the forensic experts are typically trained well in. So argumentation, here you see a simple argument. The witness testifies he saw a suspect, and that would be a reason to support that the suspect committed the crime. But of course, the witness can also be mistaken, and that is an exception, let's say, to using that reason. It is about reasoning and dialogue. It is about support and attack. It is about the rules that are underlying the reasoning steps. It's about the argumentation schemes, as we call it in the literature, that are typically used and are valuable. And Wigmore, Toulmin, and Pollock are some of the names in research that go with that. These are all heroes of mine. Here you see Wigmore, an early 20th century evidence scholar from the United States, who wrote The Principles of Judicial Proof. And here you see the edition from 1930. And also nice to see the subtitle, Logic, Psychology, and General Experience and Illustrated in Judicial Trials. He already tried to do it all, let's say, in one volume. It's very nice. And here you see a diagram that he charted in 1931. And we are still, let's say, working on those kinds of diagrams in research. Now we do it in software tools. A Wigmore chart, and here you see how he diagrammed the argumentation about the Eumillian case, where Eumillian was accused of murdering Jedrzejczyk. And you should not ask me about the details of what the meaning of this diagram is, but the idea is something like some of the things at the bottom are evidence, and these are claims, and there are counter-arguments in there, and things like that. Then there are scenarios, and there the idea is compare different kinds of scenarios, contrast different kinds of scenarios, the prosecution's account of the facts, the defense's account of the facts, and these are typically thought of as coherent sequences of events. One of the good sides of scenarios, and that's something that distinguishes it from scenario thinking from argumentative thinking, is that it is an approach to make sense of the evidence. So typically, in a difficult case, such as Lucia de Burgh, the amount of material is huge, and it's very hard to understand what really is going on. And scenarios, stories are actually a tool to explain what has been going on. A story is something that tells in a very brief, succinct manner what has been going on. It is associated to the idea in the literature of inference to the best explanation. And Schenck and Abelson and Pennington and Hastie are among the researchers that are associated with it. And Pennington and Hastie are American legal psychologists that have emphasized something that's very relevant in this connection. Namely, they have shown empirically by their research that there is a risk in scenario thinking. Namely, they have shown that if a story is well told, it's very easily believed. So they have actually made mock trials, let's say, and they contrasted a well-told story that was told in the order of the events, as opposed to, let's say, in a random kind of ordering. And people believed the well-told story more easily. So there is a risk that well-told stories push out, as they said, true stories, which is something to think about. And this risk has been picked up by some legal psychologists. They have proposed the anchored narratives theory. They are friends from the Netherlands, Krombach, Van Koppen, and Wagenaar. Wagenaar already died. But what they did was they wrote a book in 1994, 1992, the first edition, on dubious cases. So they used really the scenario perspective as a normative tool. It was, let's say, also a political pamphlet, more or less. They wanted to show what went wrong in legal decisions, and they used the scenario perspective to explain what went wrong and why things went wrong. And there are, in their theory, and it's very, this is not meant as a criticism, but their theory is not well specified. So it's, let's say, about 2-3 pages in their book, and then they do something with it, because that was what their real aim was, do something relevant for the legal system in the Netherlands. But in their work, stories are important, sub-stories are also there, and they are, let's say, about the pieces of evidence. And the key issue in their work is that the stories have to be anchored in the knowledge about the world. But there is also an interesting connection to cognitive science, and that's and artificial intelligence. In fact, my background, my home field, one could say, and that's Schenck and Abelson's work on scripts, and that has to do with the coherence of our thinking. And the famous example is the restaurant script, where we understand what is going on in a restaurant by having script-like knowledge. For instance, when you enter a restaurant, that there will then be the ordering phase and the eating phase, and then the exiting phase. And at a certain point, there will be the menu. You will ask for the check, and you will pay the bill, and things like that. These coherent wholes are, in their theory, associated with our thinking, and they are, in fact, also, let's say, at the heart of scenario thinking for evidence. And then there is probabilities. Here you see what is called the likelihood ratio formula. That's the formula, and I see that it's a little bit different on these screens than I had it on my own laptop computer. Don't worry about it. But this is a famous formula, the likelihood ratio formula, and this is what typically is used by forensic experts to report on the value, the evidential value of a piece of evidence. So what you need to understand is that a prior odds is assumed. That's, let's say, the odds that the hypothesis is true before the evidence was found, and you are interested in the odds, the posterior odds, after the evidence is found, and then there is a formula that the difference between those two odds, the prior and the posterior odds, is exactly the likelihood ratio formula. And sometimes, and this is why this formula is so successful, sometimes you can actually compute the likelihood ratio even when you don't know the prior odds. And that can be helpful because then at least you have information about the incremental step from before the evidence and after the evidence. So here's an example. I like this example because it surprised me how the actual statistics in the Netherlands about crimes is. So initially, the prior odds of a Dutch person to be convicted for a crime in the Netherlands is 1 in 200, something like that. About 95,000 people are convicted for a crime, and there are about 20 million Dutch. But when you appear before a court, so let's take that as an evidence, you appear before a criminal court, then the odds are much worse for you. Namely, then 95,000 people are convicted and 5,000 are let go. So there are about 100,000 people that appear before a court. So then the odds are 90 against 1. And well, then the likelihood ratio can be calculated. It's about 3,800, which is a quite good likelihood ratio. And here you see the same information embedded in a Bayesian network. And this gives the numbers a little bit differently, but look at this number, 95%. So if you appear before a court, 95% of the people become convicted. So for a psychologist, that means, well, we're done. 5% error rate. But that's, of course, not what we would like to see happen. We would like to see that the judge and the juries look well into the case and decide about the specific situation. Characteristics of probability are the probability distributions, the Bayes rule, which is one of the important formal rules. There is also work on graphical structures, Bayesian networks that, as I've indicated here, model the dependencies between the elements that are relevant in a case. So that's why also Bayesian networks are famous. They combine qualitative and quantitative elements, and Bayes, Wigmore, and Pearl are some of the famous names there. So to summarize on the three normative frameworks, they all have good and bad sides, let's say. Argumentation has support in attack, which is so important in courts. They also have a normative framework, but I must admit, and this is something where I'm a little bit critical about my own community, because I'm at heart an argumentation researcher. We do have some kind of normative frameworks, and we do have good work, but unfortunately it does not yet have the status, let's say, of the normative framework that is provided by statistics. We need better models, one could say. But there is a strong bridge to the legal context. That's something that's good. For scenarios, it's a little bit different. The strongest point probably of scenario thinking is the global perspective, the sense-making, the holistic understanding of the evidential situation. Unfortunately, scenario models are completely informal typically. There is some work on formalizing scenario thinking, but it's typically not at all well specified. So as a normative framework, it is, let's say, at least something to work harder on. And then there's probability, but there is also the strong bridge to the legal context because people tend to think in terms of scenarios. Then there's probabilities. A very strong aspect of probabilities is their gradual uncertainty, and also, of course, the statistics and scientific value that goes with it. As a normative framework, also it is unquestioned. So I know some philosophers that don't like probabilities, but typically the rules of statistics are accepted. But it is very hard to communicate probabilistic information, statistical information in a legal context. So there is some work to do. And this is in fact what this project is all about. This is a project that I'm leading in the Netherlands, and now during this year I'm doing that using Skype and tools like that. It's an interesting experience because the PhD students working on this project are still in the Netherlands. Some of them will, one of them will come here at the end of the month. It's called Designing and Understanding Forensic Bayesian Networks with Arguments and Scenarios. And what we do there is we are thinking about the relations between arguments, scenarios, and probabilities in evidential reasoning. It was inspired by work that was performed by Floris Becks in a previous project. He was working on the combination of argument models and scenario models as an artificial intelligence and law researcher. But then we thought, let's also work on probabilities because that's so relevant to understand. And in Utrecht, Sjoerd Timmer is working on the combination of arguments and probabilities. And Charlotte Vlek in Groningen, where I normally work, she's working on scenarios and probabilities. And what I try to do is I try to integrate the three perspectives. And if you look then at the three normative frameworks again, I've here emphasized the pluses. What you would like, or what I would like, is to keep all the pluses and get rid of all the minuses and plus minuses. And what happened this year, because I have been thinking already for a few years now about these issues, because before that, I must admit, I hardly ever thought of probabilities. That's something to tell. By my history, and everybody has their own accidental history, I've been raised, let's say, with anti-probabilistic attitudes. So as a mathematician, I took my statistics courses and I was good, it was no problem. But then I became, let's say, kind of logician, not a real one, some would say, but a kind of logician. And well, logicians only like their zeros and ones. Everything in between, so the probabilities in between, that's not what they think about. And I also started to work in defeasible argumentation, and then things become very non-standard. So everything during my whole research career has been rather non-standard. And there is a good tradition of non-standard thinking, but what has happened here during my year here, I am becoming a standard thinker. Standard logic, classical logic, and probability theory. And I must admit that a remark by Mike Genesreth has helped me make the final step in that direction. So here you see the axioms that are named after Kolmogorov, and he proposed them for probability theory. And we're not going to go through all of them, but they are very simple. One thing is that probabilities are positive, and these three axioms are actually the heart of all of probability theory. And there is also the important definition of conditional probabilities that say that you also can measure the probability of an event psi given the knowledge about the situation phi. And what I'm doing now is I'm modeling argumentation and scenario thinking using just those classical tools, standard probability theory and its associated classical logic. The basic idea is very simple idea. There is evidence, and on the basis of this evidence, you consider different interpretations of the evidence. They are the scenarios, let's say. One interpretation of the evidence and other interpretation of the evidence. This can be the guilty scenario, this can be an innocent scenario. And you measure the argument from the evidence to the interpretation in terms of what is called a conditional probability. So here H1 is the first interpretation and E is the evidence. And you measure the strength of the argumentative step by using that number. That's it. And for certain reasons in the history of research, this idea has not been is not popular these days. For instance, there is a lot of criticism about the use of conditional probabilities as a kind of strength, but that's what I'm working on. I believe that it's actually the right perspective, or at least a very useful perspective. So let me give you a feeling of how I think that evidence really works. And I'm going to show you a picture and gradually show you a little bit more, because that's what evidential reasoning is all about. You look ever better at the case. That's what you do as an investigator, also as a judge. You want to understand what the case is all about, and what you do is you work hard and look at the case. So I'm assuming that nobody already recognizes this picture unless you have already seen me give a variant of this talk. But now you may have already an idea about what is on this picture, and now you certainly think that this is a pipe. But some of you may also think that it was not a pipe. I don't know whether you knew this painting, but this is the famous painting with Ceci n'est pas une pipe by René Magritte called La trahison des images. And I recently discovered that it's actually in California, this painting. So maybe some of you have gone there. It's in Los Angeles somewhere. I still would like to see it. I have been in Los Angeles this year, but I did not go to see this painting. It's a great painting, of course. But what is important here is decision-making under uncertainty is, let's say, a kind of identification. Because in the end, there is no uncertainty anymore. So you probably experience a kind of uncertainty when I showed you the first part of the image. Well, what does he want to do? Something like that. But at a certain point, you are certain that is a pipe. And then you recognize, oh, okay, that's that Magritte painting. I knew that. I've seen that before sometime. At a certain point, there is no uncertainty anymore. And why does the uncertainty disappear? Well, because you have looked ever better, and at a certain point, you have seen enough to be able to identify what was going on. And that's also what should happen in a crime, or at least what you attempt to do. So let's give an example, a robbery case. There was this is an imaginary case to explain the ideas. So there is a robbery case, and it's a jewelry robbery, and there is a videotape of what was going on. And when the investigation starts, the police, they are called, they get a phone call, and they hear about the robbery, and they think, well, we know who typically are the robbers in our city. So they have immediately a list of 8 people that they think, well, we should consider these as the usual suspects. They are typically the ones that we should investigate further. And they go to the jewelry store and they find there the videotape, and they look at it, and what they see is that it is a single robber situation, that the robber has a large tattoo in his neck. It is one of those tattoos that go with gangs. And they think, well, of our list of 8, we know 2 as gang members. So let's first investigate them. And they invite the first of those in. They interrogate him at the police station, and they immediately see that he does not have the large tattoo in his neck. So they know that was not the robber in this situation. So they invite the other suspect, the other known gang member, and now they are lucky. It is immediately clear he has that very specific dragon-type tattoo in his neck. So they confront him with that evidence. We have the videotape, and there you see the dragon, and you have that in your neck, so please explain. And of course then the suspect is thinking about what is his best option, and he decides to cooperate and in fact confesses, and then tells that where the police can find the jewelry. So the police go to the place that has been indicated by this thief, and in fact they find the jewelry there, and the case is in a sense closed. Because of that very specific information, they now know that this suspect is really the robber. And if you doubt that these kinds of strange situations with tattoos happen, I found this example on the internet. It's not so well visible, but this person, he's a car thief, and he has been videoed. He has his name and phone number tattooed in his neck. Well. And of course, this is the internet, so you never know whether it has been staged or whether it's true, but it looked real. So let's go to the model of this story. So there is a phone call, there is a surveillance camera, there is the interrogation of the 2 suspects, and there is the jewelry found, 5 pieces of evidence. There are hypotheses H1 to H8, the usual suspects. There is the tattoo that you expect to find in the robber, and there is the location of the jewelry. So here you see a graphical depiction of what is going on. It starts at the top with 8 hypotheses. And then when the surveillance camera appears, you see that the focus becomes on 2 suspects, namely H3 and H7. And then when the first suspect is interrogated, or actually it's the third one, you see that there is no tattoo, and you then conclude that that suspect is not the robber. Then you investigate further and ask the second suspect, H7, and you indeed find the tattoo, so the other hypotheses, they become very improbable or unbelievable. And you get a new expectation, namely the jury. And when you then look for the jury, you in fact find the jury, so you can then exclude all the options, the other 7 hypotheses. So what you see here is a process of ever looking better and excluding possibilities that in the end result in a certainty. According to the model that is, of course, here, the certainty is always related to the model that you have. And it turns out that if you are going to formalize this model of the case, then you can do that all nicely within classical logic with probability theory associated with that. And that's something that for my field is something quite surprising, and it's also something that, for instance, the people who emphasize the role of probabilities don't typically do, because they don't have an argumentation and scenario perspective that goes with this example. So let's look at it a little bit further. So after the phone call, you have an argument from the evidence of the phone call to the 8 hypotheses, the 8 usual suspects. And essentially, that is something like saying, well, at least there is a positive probability that each of these suspects, that one of these suspects can have committed the crime. But of course, these hypotheses are mutually exclusive, so they provide, let's say, counter-arguments to each other. Because if you believe that Hj is true, if you believe that suspect number J is the one that committed the crime, then you cannot also believe that another suspect, I, with I unequal to J, has committed the crime. And you can very easily write that down probabilistically. So the combination, this is the conjunction, the simultaneous occurrence of I and J having committed the robbery, has a probability of 0 given the evidence. That's the model of counter-arguments. You can also model relative strength of arguments. So if you have seen the surveillance camera, 2 of the suspects are more strongly suspected than the 6 others. And you can simply write that down as an inequality of the probabilities that go with them. And here you see that the arguments have been depicted with a thick arrow and with a thinner arrow, depicting that the strength of this argument is stronger than of that argument. And perhaps more interestingly, and somewhat more complicated, is that you also can model expectations that you have on the basis of the evidence. So when the surveillance camera is seen, and you expect that if someone is the robber, that then the tattoo is actually there. So this is a counterfactual situation, because you don't know whether a certain suspect committed the crime, but if a suspect commits the crime, then you expect to find a tattoo. And this is evidentially very strong information, because if you then don't find the tattoo, then you know something important. And this, of course, depends on the 2 pieces of evidence, namely the phone call and the surveillance camera. And you can write it down actually very easily, and I've put it down here as a certainty. If you have the truth of one of the hypotheses and the 2 pieces of evidence, then you expect to find the tattoo. And I will not continue with all the examples, all the steps in this process, but what it comes down to is you start with an early situation in which you don't really know how strongly, for suspect 7, it is supported that he committed the crime on the basis of the phone call, and you end after a process of ever looking better at a situation where the evidence is so strong that you are certain that that suspect committed the crime and that he has the tattoo and that the jewelry is found. And this conjunction of information is, let's say, the small story that goes with this example. Now you may wonder, but okay, typically you don't have all the suspects available, and that's true. So there is, of course, this process of gradually finding more suspects. And that's something that you should take into account, and maybe you wonder whether this proposal that I do can model that. Well, you can. Here you see that you, for instance, could first start with 3 suspects, and then think of a few more, and then in the end you have the 8, and then in the end you find the same outcome. This can be perfectly well modeled in this example. In fact, the same statements are still there. Because at the end, you conclude, let's say, that the model is finished. And that's something that is always a difficult situation, because that's where still, of course, there is uncertainty. Formal models never can give you the answer to who committed the crime, but they can give you a tool to organize your thinking. So there is remaining uncertainty. And the remaining uncertainty is something like, well, was the theory about the case really correct? Maybe we have missed something. And that's something that is a true uncertainty that is, unfortunately, really not avoidable. Also, you have the feeling that maybe the observations are not correct. So what this shows is that you, of course, should give an appropriate amount of effort to establishing the theory. You should work hard. Investigation is important. And you should care about the observations, be very careful. And how do you promote this care? Well, and that's how court situations are typically designed. You try to emphasize that an open critical discussion is important, and that the parties that have their interest invested in them, so for instance the prosecution who would like to see someone convicted, and the defense who would like to see the truth to be about the innocence to be there, you want that to be supported by an open critical discussion. And there is also what I now call unreasonable doubt, because this is something that I've been telling already for quite some years to my friends, because I would never be a good judge, I think, because I would always have doubt. And actually this year I have found an explanation for what is going on, and it's because probably I am typically one of the people that fall into the philosopher's stance. I always continue raising doubts without ever committing to a decision. And that's something that is important in court. So in this approach, reasonable doubt exists in relation to the theory that you have. So as long as your theory still says that there is a positive probability of innocence, then in your model there is doubt. So you should never convict. But at a certain point you commit to a theory about the case. And then there is no doubt inside that model. You have certainty in that model. And then, then that's the end of it. But of course, then there is this uneasy feeling that always is there for the philosopher who thinks that maybe we are brains in vats, maybe, and a little bit more realistically, maybe there was a government conspiracy against this suspect and things like that. So what are the characteristics of the proposal? Standard probability theory with its underlying classical logic, a theory about the case and the relevant knowledge is paramount. In general, not a full probability function. That's something that is important for people who are investing in the formal part of this. Arguments pro and con with possibly a strength are important. Coherent scenarios provide the sense-making perspective. And the aim is to find a theory in which the evidence makes a scenario certain. So what I claim is that now we have one normative framework, and it was one that we already had. Standard probability theory with its underlying classical logic. And you have all the pluses. So there is the support and the tech of argumentation. There is the global perspective provided by scenarios. And there is the gradual uncertainty by probabilities. We do have the bridge to the legal context associated with argumentation and with scenarios. And we now have a strong, well-founded normative framework. So what about Lucia de Berg then? Would this perspective have really helped? Well, that's of course something that you never know. But some explanation can be given using the same perspective of what happened. So there was the evidence of the incidents. So that was a very strange situation. There were quite some situations, deaths and resuscitation, that Lucia was around. And one hypothesis that goes with that is that, well, it was just chance. But what was forgotten is that there was another hypothesis that you were really interested in, namely the murder. You wanted to contrast the chance hypothesis with the murder hypothesis. And in fact, those were not the only two options. There was also the possibility that maybe Lucia was someone who wanted to go to the harder case and things like that. And the only thing that was reported was about the strength that if it was pure chance, then the incidents were there. And that was the number that was reported by the statistician. But that was, of course, not what we were really interested in. We wanted to know how strongly is the murder hypothesis supported by the incidents. And that's, unfortunately, something that is not in this number. So once again, decision-making and uncertainty as identification by iterated observation. Ever look better at a case, you don't expect that the normative framework is going to make things easy for you. But such a framework can help prevent avoidable mistakes and may also give rise to a new generation of rationality software. And I see that Roland is already thinking that I should move on towards the end. And I'm almost there. Because what happened in the field of artificial intelligence and law is that we started to build rationality support software. And when we found out that the expert systems of the 1980s were having limited value, they were valuable, but not in all situations, especially not in situations such as in crimes, where the details of the case matter, where the differences of the case with other cases really matter. What we started to do was we started to build argumentation software in which the user is building the theory about the case. And here you see software that I built and that I wrote about in this book dating from 2005. But one strong limitation of those kinds of software is that they don't have a well-established theory yet. They are very interesting, so I like, of course, my own tool, but there are other tools that are really nice and interesting, so I can point you to them if you like. But there are other tools that have a strong scientific basis. And here you see Charles Brenner, and Marcello Di Bello and I have visited Charles Brenner in Berkeley. He's someone who has invested a lot in forensic thinking, DNA thinking, evidence thinking. Very interesting person. And you see here, it's not so well visible, but you see him here presenting his results on DNA and DNA modeling using his own software that he has been building for over decades, and it is still one of those text-based user interfaces of the word perfect style, if you remember them. But this software has a strong scientific foundation. The statistics underlying that is very good and interesting. But how nice would it be to have, let's say, these kinds of graphical interfaces that are useful for also other people than statisticians to go with these kinds of strongly founded statistical models. That's something that I would like to see. And I'm inspired by also this example. Maybe you've seen the Homeland series. In the Homeland series, also there is a scene where it is important to make sense of all the information that is available. It's a series about counterterrorism. And here you see the woman, Carrie, who is very good at investigating, but at a certain point she breaks down and she has all this material, all these papers that are there on the wall, are all over the floor, and her colleague, the man over there, has to make sense of that because she has a breakdown. And what he then does is he uses the color scheme and makes a storyline on the wall, and you see here that here's the red and here's the orange and there's the purple. And what is important there is a hole. Here there is nothing. And that is very important to make sense of all this data. And you can think of software that can integrate these kind of graphical elements into a package with the well-founded statistics underlying it and with also the argumentation diagrams that go with it that are so well understandable. And as a final remark, if these and other issues that I mentioned are interesting to you, I can recommend this event on May 30. Marcello Di Bello here in the audience and I are organizing a debate, let's say, on trial with and without mathematics. We are quite proud of the people that we have been able to gather. They come from different sides of research, legal, philosophical, and computational perspectives of the role of mathematics in courts are well represented. And if you are interested, please join us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bart, so I'm sure there's a few questions. Maybe I can ask the first one. Because I actually have to dash out to get prepared for class. How do you model for human biases, like confirmation bias of the investigators or other biases? So how does that fit into your model? Where does that fit?
So the example of confirmation bias is very good because it is associated also with tunnel vision. So in the Lucia de Burgh case, for instance, the tunnel vision was that she was the murderer. And the way this approach addresses that problem, consider alternative hypotheses and distinguish the confirmation, the things that you really believe in, the tunnel vision ideas, by contrasting your favorite hypothesis with other possibilities. And this is a lesson that all of the normative frameworks have. So you have the tunnel vision proposal in argumentation, you have that in scenario thinking, and you have that in statistical thinking. And it is something that you just have to tell, let's say. And it is hard to avoid that because everybody at a certain point has this tunnel vision. And in fact, you can say that the theory that you commit to at the end is also a kind of tunnel vision because there could be more, and that's true. But that's then the tunnel vision that you have committed to explicitly, hopefully.
Any other questions? Sir?
Oh. May 30, also not in this building, but at Stanford. It is in the Paul Brest Hall West. That's, I think, over there. It's full day, a full day. So it starts at 9:30, and it ends at about 6.
And there are posters downstairs.
There are posters downstairs, and if you go to the website, you will see the speakers.
A question on your software. Is the purpose of it designed to have people, say, type in all the facts they have and then give out probabilities of where they should head from there? Is that what you're trying to do in that software? So every time the, say, police get a new fact, they would type it in whatever form that you have, and then it would kind of, one, potentially eliminate people and make it easier for them when there's so much evidence to correlate that our minds are not as capable, and two, to increase probabilities. Is that the goal?
So what I would like to see is, because this software does not exist, right? Let me first emphasize
Of course.
That. What I would like to see is a tool that you can work with. So if you and I would work on a case, and you are the statistical expert, you would input your statistical data and information and interpretations in the system, and I, maybe a lawyer, would transform that information into arguments, and someone else might look at the scenarios that go with it, and you would like to see that all these kinds of bits and pieces that go together are formatted in the same normative framework. So you, just like you use a word processor to gradually develop a text, and the word processor makes sure that you don't make spelling errors and things like that, you could imagine a software in which all kinds of avoidable errors, such as flipping the condition and the conclusion in a conditional probability, are not there. For instance, because they show the direction of the arrow in the form of a graphical representation or things like that. So that's how I'm thinking of it. So it is also associated with mind mapping software. So many people have defended the role of mind mapping, and you can here think of a case management tool that helps you to build your case.
I guess one of my biggest concerns is, as a former criminal defense attorney, one of the things that this will lead to is it will lead to greater emphasis on the facts that you do know and less emphasis on finding new facts. Because the idea is, let's say you have 12 facts and it leads to an 80% probability of one person, it would lead you to focus on that one person rather than recognizing that if you had another 50 facts that you should be gathering, that person's probability would go down to 3% and there'd be 17 other suspects. And my concern with this is that in a system where everyone is rushed, time pressure, money pressures, it's easy to jump to false conclusions and blame science for reaching these false conclusions, which I'm sure you fear as a problem.
So I share this fear with you, and it is a fear that is very hard. That's very important, and the mistakes that are made are very hard to fight. So what I do and also try to do and would like to see software also do is fight that problem. Because you have to emphasize over and over again that you should look beyond where you already are. That's the basic idea. So you have a perspective and look beyond that. And it's very hard. And, well, you probably have done practical experience with that, so you know how hard it is. I have seen bad cases. And software is, of course, a limited tool. But for instance, you can think of just over and over again having the software emphasize that you should look beyond what you already have. And for instance, what I like about the proposal that I here do, you don't have to commit to all that many numbers. So that's one of the problems that typically Bayesian thinkers fall into. They commit to many more numbers than they actually have, because the tools that they now use force them to commit to numbers. So for instance, my PhD students, they use Bayesian network software, and they require a full specification of the probabilities of, that are associated with the crime that they are modeling. But that's ridiculous. So many of the numbers don't have real meaning, let's say. You have a few numbers. A few numbers are meaningful. So what I like to see this software do is keep the possibility of focusing only on a few numbers that you have, and the other numbers are not there. And then there is a natural way of avoiding tunnel vision, because one of the things then is that you don't assume in your model that you have already all the elements. There is not, let's say, the assumption already built in the model that everything is already there, that the sum of the hypotheses is one. Because that's the statistical explanation of saying that you have all the information. You just have positive possibilities with a positive probability. And you don't know whether the sum of those probabilities is 1. It could be less. There could be more that you don't know about. And because you don't have to, in this method, you don't have to commit to give all the numbers, you then avoid a little bit more than typical this problem. But still, people are people, etc.
Right. So just so I guess my vital concern is that, and I'm sure it is with you as well, is that the model includes insufficient data, so that let's say you begin with your 8 suspects, that somewhere along the line you might say the probability of each of those 8 suspects could be 2%, and there could be 80+% that it's someone else and then, for insufficient data.
And then you cannot convict someone. That's something that happens a lot. So the real problem that you do not always know what has been going on, that you do not always solve a case, that's something that we have to live with. And mathematics and these models, they don't help with that issue. The investigators will have to work hard, and sometimes we as a society are lucky that the case really becomes solved. Yeah?
Anyone else? What's happened to Lucia?
So, I don't know why you say why, but she was released after a long societal debate. So some people very heavily invested in explaining why the reasoning that led to the conviction was wrong. And also there were more investigations. And the little evidence that was there, that was not statistical, was, let's say, also strongly questioned. And she was released after years of debate. There are books about it that are very interesting to read, also from, let's say, a research sociological perspective, because also those books are not so subtle, let's say. They are also strongly biased towards one side of what was going on. Well, that's the way it works. But now, at least we as a public and also the courts that were looking at this case are convinced that there were no murders and that she therefore was wrongly convicted. She left jail, let's say, and in the Netherlands there is then a system of paying money because of the error that was made by the system. So she has been given an amount of money to compensate for the damages that she suffered. We don't know how much, but it must have been quite something, because 6 years in jail, that's not nothing. And well, I don't know what she's now doing with her life. I saw that on the internet she has a Twitter account. I never checked that, but she is still around. That's. I heard that also some people did not really like her attitude, which is interesting. So apparently when she was released, she was quite proud of her success of being released or something like that. And that was not by everybody judged as being a nice attitude, but well, we don't know. Innocent, that she was innocent. Because there was the conviction that there were no murders. No murders at all. It is really bad. Were natural deaths. So also the people, think of the families of these people. They have lived with the idea that their relatives were murdered, and they thought that Lucia was the murderer. And now, after years, they will have to believe that the deaths were natural after all. Very hard to imagine how that feels for the relatives of those dead babies and seniors. Yeah. Life can be complicated. Thank you for your attention. I think it's over.